Hello.
Our story begins on Coruscant inside of the Jedi Temple. Obi Wan had just learned that a student was responsible for what had just happened inside the temple. He watched as holograms showed Anakin killing Master Sindralik and his two Padawans. A later hologram showed Anakin kneeling before the Dark Lord of the Sith. Yoda told Obi Wan that they had to destroy the Sith. Obi Wan agreed, but the notion of him going to fight Anakin was unreasonable. He couldn't do it. They were like brothers. It was his student and his best friend. But Yoda plainly said that he didn't believe Obi Wan was skilled enough to fight Sidious. It could be accurate, but Yoda also didn't want Obi-Wan to get in the way. Yoda saw the situation as he needed absolute focus on the situation at hand. It's not just Obi-Wan, but if it was any other Jedi Master, he wouldn't feel comfortable confronting Sidious. Not Plo, Mundi, Dappa, nor Mace. He saw Darth Sidious as his opposite in the Force, the one being who could rightly challenge him. Yoda needed all of his attention on the fight with Sidious because if he couldn't do that, then he could lose, which in other words was Yoda suggesting that Obi-Wan would be distracting during his engagement with the Emperor. Obi-Wan pleaded with Yoda to allow him to accompany him to the fight with the Emperor, but his pleas were silenced. Yoda told Obi-Wan that they needed to stop Sidious and Anakin. If they didn't, then the galaxy could crumble. Anakin was far too powerful to be left alive. His power was only growing by the minute, and the only person to stop him in the entire galaxy was Obi-Wan. Sure, Anakin dispatched the temple guards and the Jedi Battle Master, but that didn't equate to the teacher's bond with their student. Yoda, having trained someone like Dooku, knew this. Obi-Wan may have been talented, but he never stood a chance against the general talent that was Dooku. Yoda, having taught him, knew all of his moves before he made them. Obi-Wan tried once more, but Yoda silenced him, telling him that there was no use to resisting. He looked over at Master Kenobi and told him to trust his feelings. He could find Anakin that way. Yoda would make a move on the Emperor once the Senate adjourned. Obi-Wan bowed in respect and gave a heartbroken yes, master, before the two of them split up and went their separate ways. Yoda made his move for the Senate building, and Obi-Wan went to Padme's residence. On the way over to her apartment, he thought about what would happen if he were to do what he was told to do. Surely Anakin was somewhere in there. The man he saw in the hologram was not acting like Anakin. He was very displeased and unsettled. His figure was that of a man possessed by the dark side of the Force, and yet none of it made any sense to Obi-Wan. He believed that if he interacted with Anakin in this state, it could set him off in the wrong direction. In his own opinion, it would be best to unite against Sidious and then Anakin. See, there was one thing that Obi-Wan feared happening, which was Anakin's overconfidence taking over him. He had this nasty pride and arrogance issue. He'd always had it, but as an adult, and especially one influenced by the dark side of the Force, it could only spell bad tidings for him if he showed it. Obi-Wan still went to Padme's residence though, believing that maybe she would help him decide. She of course was closer to Anakin than anyone else, and even Obi-Wan knew that. He shared feelings with Satine, and so he was fully aware of what the faces he made to hide whenever someone brought her up. Qui-Gon did it numerous times to him when he was a Padawan, though Obi-Wan believed that Qui-Gon was just pulling at his own leg because he knew what Obi-Wan didn't. He didn't quite have the same relationship with Anakin. Sure, there was teasing and good banter, but trying to dig at Anakin's personal life would have been a bit too far. The little phrases such as "tell Padme I said hello" were about as far as he would go. Regardless, he eventually arrived at Padme's residence, and she seemed dissatisfied to see him, like there was something she knew that he didn't. What she thought she knew was a blatant lie told to her by her husband, and Obi-Wan would learn of that very quickly once their conversation began. Obi-Wan would tell her everything he'd seen inside the temple, and how Anakin had become a very great threat. She obviously didn't believe him, and then when he went further and told her that the man she married killed a bunch of younglings, she drew the line. She couldn't believe what Obi-Wan had said. It sounded like Anakin was right. The Jedi were trying to take over. But how could Obi-Wan say that? Of course, Kenobi was thinking of why didn't he bring a hologram of Anakin's massacre inside the temple, but he was even more bewildered that Padme wouldn't believe him. Sure, Anakin was her husband, but Obi-Wan had never lied to her. They'd been friends for 13 years without ever lying to each other, that is aside from the relationship. Obi-Wan asked her to tell him where Anakin went, and she wouldn't. This left Obi-Wan with two choices, the latter of which he made. He got up and sadly made his way to his vessel. He asked if Anakin was a father before apologizing and leaving. Of course, Obi-Wan was going to sneak onto her ship while she was organizing herself and preparing to launch. Obi-Wan made his way for the landing platform where her ship was and awaited her arrival. He wondered to himself if there was anything more he could have said, or if there was something better he could have done during their training. Anakin was always going to be a difficult student, but massacring the temple was not something he ever thought a student would do. Turning to the dark side and killing children, the weight of it all sat on Obi-Wan's heart. His belief was that it was his fault. The teachings that the Jedi would have him believing that it to be true. Actions of the student fell solely on their teacher, which would explain Yoda's sadness and guilt over the loss of Dooku. It was a tragic loss for him, his final student. Obi-Wan felt that to an extent now, and maybe even greater. The worst truth is that in reality it wasn't his fault. Anakin made actions and he had the free will to choose them. As Obi-Wan dwelled in his sorrows, he saw that Padme was making her entrance to the ship, and he made sure he discreetly got himself aboard the ship and waited for liftoff. As he entered the vessel, he knelt down. He could hear the engines gearing up, the sound of the landing gear grinding, preparing themselves to be sucked into the ship, and it hit Obi-Wan, like a flash, or a blur of memories altogether. If Yoda survived the purge, then that's exactly what Palpatine would have wanted. He would have wanted to bring Yoda to him and trap him. It wouldn't be a fair fight. Surely the Sith Lord could sense that Yoda was still alive. Obi-Wan, in a state of perpetual panic, leapt up and ran down to the landing gears and squeezed off the ship before the gears were sucked into the vessel and slipped into space. Of course, Obi-Wan put a tracker on the ship before sneaking off. He wasn't going to just ignore Yoda's request, well, entirely. He took a page out of Anakin's book for this, ironically. Obi-Wan quickly made his way to the Senate building to help out the Grand Master of the Jedi Order. Little did he realize that the fight had begun before he got there. Yoda entered the Emperor's office and the two of them threw each other across the room before engaging in a lightsaber duel. Palpatine was in all actuality surprised that Yoda survived. Sure, he could have tried to predict it, but he assumed the clones had done their job. That wasn't the case, and now Sidious was in a fight for his life, fending off the Grand Master of the Jedi Order and taking as much of a fight to him as he possibly could. Their fight led to the Senate chambers. When Obi-Wan arrived, he ran through the hallways, ducking and dodging clones, Senate guards, and anyone else who was up and about. His heart rate picked up. He for the first time truly felt the power of the Sith Lord. It was intoxicating. It left his body numb for a moment, and while his feet couldn't carry him fast enough, it felt like he was running in place. As his boots carried him to the Chancellor's office, he saw that the pedestal that the Emperor resided on was in the air, which meant that Yoda and Sidious had carried their fight onto the chambers themselves. He then heard a massive crash. It sounded like a pod or a boulder slammed into the ground. What on Coruscant could they be doing up there? Obi-Wan turned the corner and ran out of the room. Coming across a number of clone troopers on the way out, he lifted them up with the force and threw them into the ceiling as he continued pushing himself forward as fast as he could. He got up to a layer of pods and ran out. He turned and saw Yoda leap up a couple of stories. Kenobi ran out onto the pod and heard electricity, and then the Dark Lord and the Sith laughing in some sort of crazed manner. He then heard a boom as Yoda was sent flying across the chambers. Obi-Wan looked up to see where Sidious was. He reached out with the force and lifted Yoda up ever so slightly so that he wouldn't slip, before turning his head back and looking up and jumping. Kenobi scaled the Senate pods as fast as he could. Yoda, on the other hand, panicked. His lightsaber was at the bottom of the Senate chambers, possibly gone. He reached out with the force, almost in a fearful manner, trying to find what was most certainly a needle in a haystack. Once Kenobi got up to Sidious' Senate pod, he was confused. Where'd he go? Obi-Wan heard the sound of a lightsaber moved out of the way, barely, surviving the encounter. He fell to the ground in the Senate pod and pulled out his own lightsaber to block a jab away from him. It was an awkward strike, but the jab slammed right into the side of his robes, not hitting skin. Obi-Wan slid over and tried to get back up, moving as quickly as he could to his feet, ducking under another swing, barely surviving each strike made by the Sith Lord. Sidious knew that Yoda would be here soon, and he could deal with that when he got here. For the time being, he needed to kill Kenobi. Obi-Wan was picked up with the force and thrown into the hallways between the Senate pods. He looked up. There was a severe disadvantage when fighting someone like Sidious, and it was a fact that he was a monster. Obi-Wan slid his lightsaber into his hand and blocked another wave of strikes. Had Sidious not lost his other lightsaber, the chances of this being resolved by now were more than likely. Kenobi was a master of Form 3, but Sidious mastered all 7 forms as a testament to embarrassing the Jedi. His swift strikes were far too fast for Obi-Wan, and he knew it. He could keep this pace for a long time with Anakin, but this wasn't his former student. Obi-Wan made a daring decision. He flipped forms mid-defense and moved into Qui-Gon's old form in Form 4. This move blindsided Palpatine, and the Sith Lord was caught off guard for a slight moment. He quickly defended himself, but realized he had enough of playing with his food. Sidious stepped back and jabbed forward with all of his strength and threw Obi-Wan from his balance. His lightsaber flipped off across the room, and Sidious cackled, unleashing the full power of the dark side in Obi-Wan's body. The lightning bled from Palpatine's hands, and Obi-Wan could do nothing but cry out in agony. Obi-Wan couldn't do anything but suffer. He ate the electricity without the ability to defend himself or stop the onslaught. Obi-Wan felt the lightning course through his body, believing that he would die here, on these carpets. The pain reached a new height every single passing second, and he couldn't escape it. That is, until it did stop. He thought the Dark Lord was showing him mercy, but instead he heard Sidious turn around with rage in his voice. It was Yoda. He seemingly had saved him. There was some dialogue shared between the two of them, but most of it was inaudible for Kenobi. He looked over and watched Sidious thrust his blade forward, and the two were back at it again. The avatars of light and dark fighting with each other, the fight for the fate of the universe. If the Jedi lost, then the dark side would reign supreme. If the Sith lost, then the light could return to the galaxy. Obi-Wan looked over, his vision hazy, but he could pick up blurs and lights. He would be no match for Sidious in this condition. Not that he was much of one to begin with. He could hear advantages slipping and seizing for both duelists. It was a dance, and Obi-Wan knew one thing. Yoda's form would wear him down, which could happen with Sidious, but he was unaware at this point if that was true. Kenobi stumbled to his feet, his robes covered in char from being burned so badly, his skin sizzling and steam rolled off his back as he ignited his lightsaber. There were always alternatives to fighting. Obi-Wan knew that, especially as he struggled with being able to see. So he used his blade and cut off a piece of his robes and slung the cloth over his eyes and tied it behind his head. He'd be much weaker with his vision, so he closed his mind off and felt through the Force. The blurry vision he had when he watched on vanished, and now he could make out clearer figures. It was a work in progress, but it was a good thing it was Obi-Wan. His extensive training and meditations assisted him with feeling confident in the moment, having no problem with taking control and becoming comfortable in a position that otherwise would have left him essentially defenseless. He paced forward ever so slightly, feeling the heat of the lightsaber confrontation blast away just a short little ways in front of him. Kenobi began to utilize his other senses and use them to the best of his ability, to ensure he could provide them with the most assistance to the Grand Master. Sidious saw that Obi-Wan had covered his eyes and prepared himself for death. How quaint. The Dark Lord moved back around to strike down Kenobi, and to his dismay, the strike was blocked with perfection. Sidious had to move away from Kenobi because if he didn't, then he'd be struck down by the Grand Master. Sidious quickly defended himself from the likes of the Jedi Grand Master, and as he did, he could feel Obi-Wan confidently approaching him. The perfect block sent a ripple through their blades, and Obi-Wan became even more confident in the moment, not arrogant. As the Jedi approached Sidious, the duel caught the attention of numerous clones and guards, which forced Kenobi to take point against the clones as Yoda kept up the barrage against Sidious. It was tedious, but Obi-Wan was able to use the Force to move the clones from in front of him, slamming them in the walls and such. When Kenobi turned around to face Sidious, the Dark Lord had thrown Yoda into the wall and was preparing to end Kenobi, before destroying his rival in the Force. Sidious felt nothing but confidence and power. Obi-Wan could feel it. His overconfidence was his weakness. There was no reason for him to feel anything less than that. He'd thrown Kenobi around and now he was blind. Obi-Wan felt very vulnerable. He couldn't use the best he had to offer to defend himself, so he had to be at his mental best. Sidious spun the blade around in his hand. A devious growl crawled through the air, and Obi-Wan felt it. He said to himself that he was one with the Force and the Force was with him. He repeated the sentence to himself a number of times, and Sidious drove his blade forward, and Obi-Wan gracefully moved out of the way, synchronizing himself with the Force, becoming a movement with it. He felt truly connected in a way he never had before, and when Sidious turned around, his anger heightened. He was furious, driving his blade forward as Kenobi awkwardly spun the blade into a reverse grip to smack the weapon away from him. It worked, and Obi-Wan spun himself forward, throwing his blade outwards. Sidious at the same time reached his scaly, wretched hands around Obi-Wan's neck, with the intention to keep him still so he could thrust his blade through him. Obi-Wan felt Sidious's cold, slimy hands go from coarse to stiff. A moment was all it took. He could feel it. The darkness seething from the Sith Lord dissipated and started slipping away. It was a strike that landed true, extinguishing the life of the Sith Lord. Sidious slowly dropped to the ground, his knees slamming into the carpets before the rest of his body fell behind it. Yoda crawled out of the crevice in the wall. He looked extremely worried, but he could see that Obi-Wan was alright. He was standing, still as a statue, his mind seemingly lost. Obi-Wan turned to Yoda's direction and called out, asking if he was alright. Yoda confessed that he was wrong to not bring Kenobi with him, but expressed his curiosity and worry for where Skywalker might be. Obi-Wan pulled out a small device and tossed it towards Yoda, who caught it and looked at it. It seemed like Anakin went to Mustafar. They needed to get there quickly, as fast as they could. On Mustafar, Anakin and Padme were having a conversation, though it wasn't a good conversation. It started out with Padme telling Anakin of what Obi-Wan said to her, and how she was worried about him. She was even suggesting that Obi-Wan was trying to help, because even though she didn't believe him, she was inclined to believe that he had their best intentions at heart. Anakin was very disgruntled by this notion of Obi-Wan, which firstly set Padme off. He'd spoken highly about Obi-Wan several times, and without concern for his survival or even at that point a little bit of joy for having him survived, she realized there was something off. Anakin expressed not wanting to hear about Obi-Wan anymore. He went on a tirade about being able to overthrow the Emperor and rule the galaxy on his own, and with her by his side. Something finally clicked in her mind. She realized that the man she loved was gone. There was something else inside of his body. His ego got the best of him, or the dark side, or craziness, but none of it made any sense to her. She backed away from him, and even without Obi-Wan present, he dug deeper into the dark side. His rage was washing over him because of the slight mention of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and in his insane mind, he believed that his wife was cheating on him with Obi-Wan. As she backed away, telling him that she didn't know him anymore, he reached out his hand. If she didn't know who he was anymore, then he would force her to see. He would make her understand that he was beyond powerful, that he did all this for her when in reality, it was never something that she wanted, something that she never asked for. The murder of the Jedi younglings and even the Separatist leaders went against her code of ethics. She would rather see them behind bars or just plain alive. She reached for her neck, begging that he stop, and yet he didn't listen, going far enough to knock her out. She dropped to the ground. A sense of confusion washed over his prideful face. His anger was far too much for him to control. The dark side had finally taken control after all these years, and he couldn't resist its pull. He put Padme into her vessel and prepared to have C-3PO piloted away, but he forgot his trusted gift, R2. Padme gave Anakin her droid and her his. It was their way of exchanging rings, and poor R2 was seated on a landing platform all by himself, waiting for Anakin to return. Skywalker walked off the platform and into the industrial complex. He wanted to be sure that Palpatine wasn't trying to contact him. In Anakin's mind, he could surely take over the Senate for himself once he returned, but he had to be sure his master wasn't privy to his plans nor his actions. When he got back, he learned that there had been no communication attempts made by Sidious, so he left the room and walked through the halls and the corridors back to his ship. As he got there, he found R2 and waved him on, not even calling him by his name. Some say droids can't feel, but this hurt. He was a trustworthy companion and did nothing to deserve that treatment. The moment R2 put his third wheel to the ground, the sound of a ship buzzing could be heard. Anakin turned around. It was a Jedi ship. Who could it be? He let the ship land, almost curious to see if Ahsoka had survived or maybe someone else. When the doors opened, he looked up the ramp and his knees buckled a little. Yoda and Obi Wan. By this point, Obi-Wan could see a lot more clearly, and he no longer needed the blindfold. Skywalker asked if they were here to save his soul, and before Obi-Wan could open his mouth, Yoda let out a silent but blood-curdling no. Obi-Wan looked down. Yoda wasn't showing any signs of using the dark side, but he came here to eradicate the Sith. They took everything away from him. His greatest failure as a teacher, as a Jedi, as a man, was his inability to see how far Skywalker had fallen. Yoda lifted his robe a little and pulled a lightsaber into his hand. Obi-Wan wasn't aware, but when they were in hyperspace, Yoda said he was going to meditate to recharge himself as best as he could, to get back into his full strength. Little did Obi-Wan realize that Yoda had surrounded the two of them with an ancient battle meditation. He used it on himself versus Sidious, and now he would be protecting both himself and Kenobi. Anakin didn't like this move made by the Grand Master, and ignited his lightsaber in response. This was it. His chance to prove his strength, to show not just himself but the Jedi that he was greater than all of them, than any of them. He cut Windu's hand off, killing him essentially. He killed Sindralik and the Temple Guards and Shakti. He was the greatest Jedi the Order had ever seen, and everyone would know it. If it was the last thing he could do, it would be crushing Kenobi and Yoda, and then he'd be satisfied. Obi-Wan, in response to Anakin's actions, ignited his own lightsaber as they stood in silence. Behind the wicked sound of lava mountains erupting around them, Skywalker made the first move. Ah yes, Yoda knew it would come to this. The boy had no patience. He would be easier than anyone else would ever assume. Yoda knew this because it was Anakin after all. It was the same thing Yoda did to Grievous earlier in the war, let him assume that all of his power made him strong. Yoda's ally was a force, Anakin was his physical strength, and here, in his first confrontation with the Grand Master, would he understand his continuous misunderstanding of the Force? A lesson taught too many times by Obi-Wan would be finalized by Yoda. When Anakin moved in, Yoda waited till the last second, bouncing out of the way. Anakin slid across the platform, looking back at Yoda, and Obi-Wan had the perfect opportunity, but hesitated. Anakin whipped back and slammed his blade into Obi-Wan's, throwing Obi-Wan from his balance. He staggered away from Anakin as Yoda leapt back into combat. Anakin saw this as his chance to prove to himself his worth. He was the chosen one, so surely he'd have no issue dispatching the Grand Master. Yoda leapt into the air, parrying a strike made by Skywalker before moving at the speed of light. Anakin bashed as hard as he could. Yoda knew one thing: Anakin could very easily wear himself out. If he was fighting Obi-Wan, it'd be a contest of speed, but against Yoda, in Anakin's mind, it required a contest of power. Yoda's small stature was something Anakin could take advantage of. His strength was overpowering, and that's what he would do to Yoda. Typically, Yoda would use his speed and aggression to disarm an opponent, but he played differently with Skywalker. Obi-Wan lunged into the fight to help, which threw Anakin off balance. He wasn't prepared for it in the slightest, and he knew that he needed to swing the balance back into his favor. He leapt backwards and down. Obi-Wan and Yoda looked at each other and followed him. They landed on the banks of the lava river. The facility was just above them, and the heat next to the two of them burnt from the feeling it gave off. Skywalker jumped Obi-Wan when he landed, and Kenobi blocked the strike, falling backwards, and before Anakin could land a killing blow, Yoda swiped down and slashed Anakin across the cheek and down to his collarbone. He reeled backwards, and Yoda said some words expressing shame at Anakin's fall from the light, and as he did, he pulled back and released a massive burst of the Force. Anakin, who was still holding onto his face and raging over Yoda's monologue, couldn't do much to defend himself from the attack he didn't see coming. Skywalker was lifted off of his feet and slid down into the lava river. He screamed out in agony for a short moment before his body was engulfed by fire and hot liquid magma. Obi-Wan reached out, but Yoda put his hand out to the side of his body, inferring that it was time for Obi-Wan to let go. Obi-Wan's head sank, and the two of them eventually made their way for Padme's ship. Instead of taking the Jedi ship, they used the Naboo ship because it would garner safe passage. They quickly ushered themselves to Polis Massa, where Padme would give birth to, surprisingly, twins. Everything would go alright, aside from Padme asking what happened to Anakin. It seemed as if she'd forgotten the final moments of their final interaction, but over the course of a number of hours, she'd remember more and more of it, and realized that he was certainly out of his mind. Anakin acted erratically, but in her mind, he didn't deserve to die for it. Also, regardless of that, Palpatine was dead, and the Republic, now Empire, had just learned of his death. They knew the Jedi had done it. Over the next several hours, Padme would suggest that it would be in their best interest to keep not just the Jedi, but the children safe, and asked if the two Jedi could take care of them at her family's residence on Naboo for a short while. Obi-Wan and Yoda had no issue with this. They would take Padme's vessel, and Padme would head back to Coruscant on the Tantive 4 with Bail Organa. As they returned, they'd find the former Republic in shambles. The only thing they could do was try to take the power away from Masameda, who could very easily establish himself as Emperor, due to his close relations with Palpatine. It was also revealed that the Senate was fully aware of the heinous actions committed by the Jedi against the former Emperor, and now, they killed him in cold blood. Padme and Bail knew they couldn't allow Palpatine to fall into martyrdom, because if he did, then they would lose any chance at restoring the Republic. This would require a number of private investigators, and the two were all ready to go. Obi-Wan and Kelleran back. As Yoda and Obi-Wan were on Naboo, they ran into Representative Jar Jar Binks, who was responsible for saving Kelleran Beck and Grogu. Jar Jar told the two Jedi that he'd make arrangements for Master Beck and the child to be brought to them. When they regrouped, they spoke of the tragedy they all went through, but the future sat in their laps. Luke, Leia, and Grogu were that future. But Jar Jar informed them that the senators requested assistance with providing information that Palpatine was behind everything. If he was indeed the Sith Lord, then they needed to show the Senate that he was trying to set himself up as a sole ruler of the galaxy. Obi-Wan was quick to join in, and so was Kelleran. He'd worked with Terra Sanube a great many times, and so he'd be able to put in those skills to good use here. Of course, as Padme and Bail insisted that they couldn't get caught, and their sole job was to ensure Palpatine was rightly and justly accused for his crimes. He couldn't be made into a martyr. Yoda was perfectly fine with babysitting for the time being, and so the Jedi quickly moved back to Coruscant under the escort of Jar Jar Binks. On Coruscant, Padme would be left lying awake and looking at the ceiling. She couldn't deny that the stress of restructuring the Republic was hard on her, but she also had to get over the loss of Anakin. She didn't deny the truth. It was Anakin's fault. He made the choices he made and went down the path he did, believing the lie and throwing everything away for it. There was supposed to be communication between them, and it felt like a decade had passed since the last time she saw him on Coruscant and the last day of his life on Mustafar. It broke her heart, and it piled on top of her. The first night, she only got 2 hours of sleep, which in reality isn't that much. But she still went back to the Senate and continued debating her colleagues, who were trying to blame the Jedi for the possible collapse of this Republic and now called Empire, but also the entire war itself for happening. Of course, they were going to try and put Palpatine into martyrdom, and Padme couldn't live with that. It would take approximately a week of debates and hard searching by the Jedi, who added a couple of other members to their investigation to find what they needed. The key to all of it was Quinlan Vos, and it was a slap in the face, because if Quinlan had been involved with the politics of the Council, then the chances of them discovering that Palpatine was a Sith Lord were much quicker. It didn't matter. They had just given over information to the senators and the delegation of 2,000. It was perfectly timed, and the senators quickly began debate to see what would stand. It would be days' worth of information laid out in front of them, several hours of their lives dedicated to proving or disproving what could be true or false. The Jedi retreated back into hiding, and Kenobi and Kelleran made their return to Naboo to be with the Skywalker twins and Grogu. Padme would be extremely relieved when the Senate believed the delegation of 2000 and their evidence of Palpatine's deceit, though this would throw the entire situation for a loop, because now the Separatist leaders were dead. The droids had been given a total shutdown command, and the Separatist Senate now had to come to terms with the fact that their leader was secretly working for Palpatine the entire time. No one knew how to trust anymore, so the delegation of 2000, which had all the evidence, would have to take the stand in the Senate. Senators Chuchi, Amidala, Organa, and Mothma would begin to rip apart what Palpatine put in place while he was in office for 13 years. This was in turn backed by the collective Senate and even the senators from the Separatist Council. They all believed that what they had to do now is put old rivalries to the side and focus on rebuilding the future. They needed to let go of wins and losses for the greater good of the galaxy, because if they didn't, someone like Palpatine could come into office again and rip everything apart. Though because of Palpatine being a Sith Lord, they would enact a rule to ensure no one who could use the Force would have permission to become a senator, let alone the Chancellor, which was now a two-position seat. The people also saw the actions of Order 66 as a means to wipe out the collective group of people who were working against the darkness, and so the Order as a whole was revoked, and all the cloning projects were put on hold. The clones would also receive fair treatment per Senator Chuchi. During the ending of the cloning projects, the Senate would learn of Palpatine's contingency plans, which had plans of construction on Wayland and Jakku. And even though Order 66 was revoked, and the surviving members of the Order were allowed to return to peace as Knights of the Reformed Republic, they declined. They collectively gathered outside the Jedi Temple and burned it to the ground, to say goodbye to their dead, and then they vanished. Padme would take the twins back into her care, as the Jedi disappeared from the face of the galaxy. Many clones having to live with what they did, and even worse, never getting to apologize to their generals. Cody would know of Obi-Wan's survival, being ecstatic that he survived, but being that he was on Utapau when he learned of it, he never had the chance to properly apologize. By the time he returned to Coruscant, Kenobi was gone. The Jedi started a new temple in Ossus, far away from a lot of the civilized galaxy, as Kenobi took on the role of Master of the Order. He would take time to visit Padme on Naboo and see that her family had helped her raise the children. Maul would remain on the loose until the Reformed Republic sent a military force into the Outer Rim to vanquish Crimson Dawn and the other crime families that flourished under Palpatine's rule. It would be successful as an operation, and it would see the end of their kind. With the Jedi rebuilding and the Skywalker twins being kept away from knowledge or the ability to use the Force, the galaxy would evolve into a new shining light. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Again, special thanks to Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Darth Revan, Pimp Daddy Bane, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Mad Manny Studios, Anakin003, Lemon Knight, Rex the Wolf, The Man with 3 First Names, Dark Saint 46, Baron, Josh, Flynn Vassis, and Lord Deadwing for supporting the channel. If you want to support me in other ways, check out the Patreon that is linked down below. Otherwise, I hope you all enjoyed today's video. So, I caught you off guard with the beginning, I think I did. Obviously, the title is What If Obi Wan Fought with Yoda against Sidious, but I didn't want to just do that, you know, it's me. I can't just do something normal, so I had to do something abnormal. Of course I did. So that's why I had Obi Wan kind of do the loop-de-loop. Because I thought it would be more interesting, I believe, at least in my own opinion, it would be more interesting to have Obi-Wan approach the fight later. Of course, everyone's done Obi-Wan showing up early or showing up at the same time, and I've even done that scenario several times differently in this channel, and I wanted to approach it a lot differently, obviously. So I thought that was a kind of fun way to approach it. I feel like Anakin could have gone two ways on Mustafar without Obi-Wan showing up. I think Obi-Wan just pushed him over the edge, but Padme was still referencing Obi-Wan before Obi-Wan, stood up there like a bitch out for blood. So I kind of give it a coin flip, but regardless of Anakin going or not going to the dark side or force choking Padme or not force choking Padme, the truth is, he still did what he did. So even if the fight on Mustafar didn't happen, he would still have to be reprimanded. He did just kill a bunch of people for no reason. And so, it would go either way in that scenario. But anyways, I hope you all enjoyed the video. Lots of fun, different way to do it. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.